Are we good? Can y'all hear me? Is that working okay? All right. Well, here we are back again. Y'all thought you got rid of me, but once again, into the breach. So we're grateful that you're here. And as always, it's an honor to be asked to teach a course in this School of Preaching and Biblical Studies. So I'm always honored, and it's a privilege to be able to teach the Word of God. And so that's what we're going to attempt to do. So before we get started, we're going to ask Brother Jim if he would to lead us in a prayer.
Father in heaven, we're so grateful to you that we can come together on this occasion. We appreciate Brother Mark as well as you teach your class and ability to do so, Brother Eric. We ask you to look down upon your kindness and mercy, Father. Let us give thee diligent use of your word. May our faith greatly increase and our service to your kingdom be more fruitful. We can give glory and honor to you in all we do and all we say. We ask your blessing upon us this evening as we have come together. Let us always remember, dear Father, that you are our God in heaven. You have given us your grace and your wonderful word, so we can come together on occasions like this and study there today. As you so do at this time. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. All right, so if you guys will look at the syllabus just really quick, we'll look at that because if you have questions later, we can look at it. But you'll see there the course evaluations. So y'all that took the Daniel class, very similar. You get points for attendance, and he's putting holes in some of the review questions, and so we'll give those out. And those do go in order as we go through. The class notes that you take, you get points for taking those. You will be allowed to use those on both the midterm and the final. So you can use the Bible, you can use your class notes, and you can use these review questions. All those are free to use on the test. So you want to make sure you take good notes, and we'll have an outline up here. And if at any time because time constraints, I will talk kind of fast. But if you guys need me to repeat something, please can you say that again? I'll be glad to do that. But because of time, we got to go kind of quickly. So you see the approximate schedule. We'll try to stay on that, but you know how that goes. So that's kind of be about where we are. Obviously, August 25th and September 1st, those have already passed, but that's what we're doing tonight. So if you can stand both 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock, that's what we're doing. I was out of town last week. Appreciate Brother Jim for filling in for me. So we'll try to get caught up tonight. And so you can read that down at the bottom too. And that, like I said, if you have any questions next time, you can answer or ask me questions, and I'll try to help you out with that. Hopefully pretty straightforward. So we are looking at, this class is titled the Pentateuch II, or Part 2. We're going to be looking at the books of Exodus and Leviticus. Exodus and Leviticus. And so you can really divide the Bible into 5 main sections. And so, or the Old Testament rather, not the whole Bible, but the Old Testament. There are 39 books in the Old Testament, but you can really divide that into 5 main sections. And so the first section includes 5 books, which is what is referred to as the books of the law. And then you got 12 books after that called the books of history. And then you've got another section of 5 called the books of poetry. And then there's another section of 5 referred to as the major prophets. And then lastly, you've got another section of 12 referred to as the minor prophets. So that's just, you don't have to know that necessarily for the test, but just to give you a little bit of an introduction. So what we're going to be looking at, of course, is in the first section of the Bible, the books of the law, and that is what is known as the Pentateuch. Okay, and that's where our focus is going to be. So as we said, there are 5 books in the Pentateuch. So in order, they would be Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay, so last quarter, I believe Jim taught Genesis, that's Pentateuch 1. We're Pentateuch II, Exodus and Leviticus, and then there's another class, Pentateuch III, which talks about Numbers and Deuteronomy. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at. So some may ask, it's a good question, some may ask, well, why are we spending time, some would say wasting time, studying the Old Testament? Because people will say, I mean, I thought the Old Testament, that was just for the Jews, right? I mean, we're not under the Old Testament, so shouldn't we focus all of our attention on the New Testament, like Brother Eric did Corinthians, and maybe we should spend all of our time in the New Testament and not, waste our time in the Old Testament? Well, is it true that we're not under that law anymore? Well, yes, it is. When did that disappear? Yeah. So in Colossians 2:14, and some of these we might read, others I'll just mention because I want you to take a look at them, but for time's sake, we don't have time to read every single thing. But Colossians 2:14 tells us that Christ nailed the old law to the cross, right? Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. That's talking about the old law, which was contrary to us, took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. So people say, well, yeah, there it is right there. So we're not really under the old law. The old law was always designed to be temporary. God never intended that to be a permanent thing. And it was for a certain group of people at a certain group of time. But it was designed to prepare mankind for the coming of the Messiah. Okay, and like Eric mentioned, Genesis 3:15, like everything in the Old Testament and in the Old Law points to Christ in the New Testament. So the blood of animals could not cleanse our sins, and so Christ brought a new and better covenant. And we see this in Hebrews 8, verses 6 through 10. And we're not going to go read that, but you might want to write that down, make reference of it, which it tells us there that Christ brought a new covenant, a better covenant, that his blood would be able to cleanse our sins that bulls and goats could not do. But that's the way that God had always designed it. And so when we look at Matthew 5 and verse 17, when the religious leaders of Jesus' time, they accused him, well, you came to destroy the law. Does anybody know, what did Jesus tell them? Yeah, I didn't come to destroy it. I came to fulfill it, right? Think not I'm come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Okay, so yes, Jesus brought an end to the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, but it was just a fulfillment. Again, God always intended it to be temporary. So, knowing that, well, okay, then why do we want to study the Old Testament? Why do we want to spend 13 weeks looking at 2 books of the Old Testament? Romans 15 and 4, so whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. So God is telling us, well, you and I today, we may not be under what we read about in Exodus and Leviticus, so why should we study it? Why should we study it? To learn. Okay, there's a lot of lessons in the Old Testament all throughout, not just in Exodus and Leviticus, but in these books of the Old Testament. We have so many lessons that God wants us to learn. And so as we go through this narrative of these 2 great books, we're also going to make application. What does this have to do with us? What lessons can we learn from the things that we're reading about? Okay, and so God reminds us of that, and there are certain aspects of the old law that Christ reiterates in the new law. So for example, if you're talking about the 10 Commandments, how many of those do we find in the New Testament? 9, right? Which one do we not have? Keep the Sabbath holy. You don't have that. So that's why we meet on the first day of the week, not the last day of the week. But all the other ones are in there. Okay, so Christ reiterates these things in the new. We learn about the promises. We learn about the prophecies about the Messiah that are going to be fulfilled in the New Testament. So that's why God wants us to pay attention to these things. Okay, so let's get involved here with the book of Exodus. And we will spend most of this quarter on the book of Exodus. Now we've got, again, a limited amount of time. So sometimes if you do one book like Brother Eric is doing, or I did before, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you can actually read through it because we have time to do that. Well, I believe, if I counted right, and I didn't teach math for a reason, I believe there's 67 chapters of what I have been assigned to cover, and that's hard to do in 13 weeks if we read. Let's read it and then go back and talk about it. So unfortunately, we don't have time to do that. So hopefully what you all will do is read ahead of time. You've got the syllabus, and we'll try to stay as close to that as possible. Read a couple of chapters ahead, and that way you'll be somewhat familiar. What we're going to do is we might read a few here and there, but mainly we're going to make commentary on, okay, here's what we're talking about in these verses. Okay, I wish we had time to just read it word for word, but we don't. So we're going to do the best we can. So let's talk about just a few kind of introductory things. First of all, the name of the book of Exodus. Okay, now this book was originally written not as we see it in English, but in what? Hebrew, right? And so the Jews refer to this book by the name of Shemoth, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Shemoth or Shemoth. That's what they called it, and that means names, because there's a lot of names in the book of Exodus. So that's what they called it. They wouldn't have referred to it as Exodus. They called it Shemoth. Okay, so apparently, so we think about it, well, all right, well then where did Exodus, if that wasn't original, where did Exodus come from? And there's nothing wrong with it. It applies. But this was applied by the Greek-speaking Jews in about the 3rd century BC. Okay, and so when they translated it from Hebrew to Greek, they chose to call it Exodus. And that word Exodus means going out. And that's a big chunk of the book of Exodus, is, of course, about Moses leading the Jews out of Egyptian slavery. So it's an appropriate title. Let's think a little bit about the content. So as I said, I believe in the May and June quarter, Brother Jim taught the book of Genesis. That is right, isn't it, Jim? You lose track of the quarters, but I'm pretty sure he did that just recently. So the book of Genesis, among other things, tells us about the beginning of God's chosen nation, which will become what? The nation of Israel, right? So it tells us about the beginnings of that, because that's the lineage through which Jesus is going to come. So what we're going to notice in Exodus, it picks up basically where Genesis leaves off. And so it's going to continue this narrative, or the history of the nation of Israel. Okay? And so Genesis ends with the Israelites in a particular location, a particular country, which would be Egypt, right? So it ends with the Israelites in Egypt, and that's where Exodus is going to pick up the story. Okay? Now, Exodus covers a time period of roughly about 360 years, give or take a weekend. Okay? But it's right around there. Goes from the death of Joseph, which is where Genesis leads off, all the way through the building of the tabernacle. Okay, so roughly about 360 years. Now, we talked about how the Old Testament can be divided. Well, the book of Exodus itself can basically be divided into 3 main sections. And we'll notice that as we go through. So chapters 1 through 18 deal with the bondage of the Israelites in Egypt and their deliverance by God through Moses. And again, hence the name Exodus. They're going to exit or leave Egypt. So really the first 18 chapters. And then you've got chapters 19 through 24. The focus there is the giving of the law at Sinai. Okay, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And then the last section, chapters 25 through 40, deals with the building of the tabernacle. Okay? So that's just kind of a good, simple, easy way to divide out the book of Exodus. So the first section is about the bondage in Egypt and Moses leading them out, the 10 plagues, dealing with Pharaoh, all those kind of things. Then you've got the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and then finally the building of the tabernacle. All right, so who wrote the book of Exodus? That's a trick question. Who wrote the book of Exodus? Okay, so you can say God, Moses, they'd both be correct, right? So God is, of course, the author of the entire Bible, but there were human authors who actually put pen to parchment, and that would be Moses, right? So Moses is going to actually do the physical writing of it through the guidance of God, of course. And so the Bible is inspired of God. It is God-breathed, okay? But Moses will be the human author, and he will be the human author of the Pentateuch, these first 5 books of the Bible, with God's divine direction. Now, you will have some people, I don't think it's a whole lot of people, but there are some people who try to argue, well, I don't believe Moses was the author of the Pentateuch or the author of the book of Exodus. Don't think he was. Okay? Now, what we're going to concern ourselves with is the biblical evidence. Okay? I think the Bible, the evidence is overwhelming that, yes, this was written by Moses. Okay? So we want to look at 3 pieces of evidence. Number 1, the book itself identifies Moses as the author. Okay, and so you got 2 verses here, 17:14, and then chapter 24 and verse 4. And the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book. And then 24:4, and Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. So the book itself tells us that Moses was the human author, the one who put pen to parchment. Now, what about Jesus? Jesus also identifies Moses as the author. So in Mark 1 and verse 44, and then also in John 7 and verse 19. We're not going to go read those, but I encourage you to read those, and where you'll see both, where Jesus is making reference to, you got these things from Moses, who of course got them from God. But Jesus identifies him as the author. And then finally also we have Paul's testimony in Acts 3 verses 22 and 23. Again, we're not going to go read that for time's sake. But Paul identifies Moses as the author. Okay? So 3 things. The book itself identifies him. Jesus, who was the Son of God, he identifies it, and then also the Apostle Paul. Now, could it be possible that they're all mistaken? Did Jesus know what he was talking about? Pretty sure he did, right? And Paul, the things that Paul wrote, he was inspired by the Holy Spirit. Pretty sure he knew what he was talking about, right? And then God, again, in the book itself tells us that. So I don't think there's any serious doubt that that's who wrote it. But you'll have some people that will argue that. But they don't really have a good alternative. You go, well, okay, if Moses didn't write it, who did? Well, I don't know, but it wasn't him. Well, right? They don't really have another theory that's got any facts behind it or any scriptures behind it. So I can confidently tell you that Moses was the author. Now, this old law, of course, that Moses is going to get at Mount Sinai, we often refer to that as the law of Moses, right? But whose law is it really? It's really God's law. I'm not saying it's wrong to call it the law of Moses, but we just want to understand the distinction. Moses wrote it down, but it came from God. So some people could get confused about this, but commonly it's called the law of Moses, the Old Testament, the Jewish law that they had to go by. And we'll notice that later on in the book of Exodus. So Moses wrote it down, and Moses delivered it unto the Israelites, okay? But it all came from God. Well, what about the date? when was this written? Well, I think we can come up with a pretty good idea. I can't tell you the exact year or day of the week or anything like that, but I think we can come up with a pretty good approximate date when this was written, because the Exodus itself doesn't particularly tell us exactly when it was written. But we can get a pretty good idea of the date for the Exodus itself. In other words, when they left Egypt and went into the wilderness, when did that take place? And that will give us an idea about when this book was written. Okay? And so we can base our calculations on some clues from the Bible. It may not explicitly state, but it does give us some clues. And again, we're in dangerous territory. We're trying to do some math here, but I think we can figure this out. So in 1 Kings 6 and verse 1, well, let's read this and we get an idea here. And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. Okay? So if we look at 1 Kings 11 and 42, we notice that Solomon reigned for 40 years. Okay, which we all basically know that. 974 to about 934 BC. Okay, so we just read here that it says in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. So if he started in 974, when did he start building the temple? It's in the 4th year of his reign. What year would that be? 974 minus 4 is 970, right? So about the year 970, remember in BC the dates go backwards, they get smaller as you go forward. So 970, and it says that was 480 years after the Israelites left Egypt. So, okay, so if we do the math there, that would mean the Exodus took place about around the year 1450 BC. Okay? And I've seen some other numbers, but they're all in that basic ballpark. But it would be around 1450 BC. Okay? So if that's true, then that would mean that's when they left Egypt. Now, what are they going to be doing for the next little while after they leave Egypt? Wandering around. How long? 40 years, right? So that tells us the wandering in the wilderness would be from about 1450 to about 1410 BC, which is also about when Moses dies. Okay? And so it would seem that the book of Exodus would have been written during that time, probably toward the end, 1410, 1420, probably toward the end of that period would be the approximate date. And overall, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. We don't have to know the exact date necessarily, but it's just kind of interesting to put it because it does go with some other historical events. Okay? All right. So let's begin then with chapter 1. As I said, we don't really have time to read these passages, but we want to hit the highlights, the main points, and so I've kind of cut it into sections. Just if you took the Daniel class, basically the same thing that we did in Daniel. So chapter 1, in the first 6 verses, you see right off the bat that Moses will list Jacob and his descendants. Okay? And they had gone to Egypt for what reason? Anybody remember? Escape the famine, right, exactly right. So they'd gone to Egypt to escape famine. And so right off the bat, we're building this bridge between the end of the Genesis account and the beginning of Exodus. Okay? And so it seems very clear that the Pentateuch it's basically a continuous story told by the same author. Again, Moses didn't just write Exodus and Leviticus. He wrote Genesis. Some people say, well, wait a minute. How could he write Genesis? He wasn't alive when all that stuff in Genesis happened. That's right, he wasn't. He was alive in Exodus. I mean, he's going to be a personal eyewitness to this, but he wasn't there in Genesis. How can he write that? Yeah, God told him what to write. He wasn't there with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. He wasn't there with Abraham, but God told him what to write. Okay? So, but here he's going to be an eyewitness to a lot of these things that he's going to put down. But you can see it's basically a continuous narrative that's clear from the style. This is the same author that's doing this by divine inspiration. So we see here that the Jewish nation begins with a pretty small number. If you look there in verse 5, hopefully you're at the book of Exodus chapter 1. All the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. Okay, so this is the humble beginnings of the nation of Israel. So it starts out with a very small number, but do you think it'll stay that way? No. Okay, it's going to begin to change fairly rapidly. And we'll see that here in this account. All right, then verses 7 through 14. If you read through that, it basically describes how the Jews are going to greatly multiply. Their population is going to increase significantly from that small beginning. They're going to have a ton of people. Okay, and so we notice, we're going to skip ahead a little bit here. Look at Exodus 12 and verse 37. Notice the number when they do finally leave Egypt. So they start out with less than 100. Exodus 12:37 says, "And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men beside children." Okay, so when they finally left, there was about 600,000 men. So who's that not counting? Women and children are not in that number. Okay, 600,000. So if each man, let's be very conservative, and let's say each man had one wife and one child. Okay, I'm pretty sure it was more than that, but that would be the low number, right? So when they left, if you do the math, that would be 1.8 million people. And that's the lowest number it could probably be. So, but back then, did most families stop with one child? That wasn't very common. Most families had a lot of children. So you're talking probably 3 million, 4 million, 5 million people. I mean, it's going to be several million people by that point that are leaving Egypt. And so we see, again, a couple of these verses I'm going to put up here for you. We're not going to go read them, but Genesis 46 and 3 and chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. We see in 46:3 that God had kept his promise to Jacob, that he made to Jacob. In Genesis 12, 1 through 3, God kept the promise that he made to who? Who was the patriarch? Abraham, right. So he had told both Jacob and Abraham and Isaac, he said, I'm going to make thee a great nation. And so by the time they leave Egypt, they are, number-wise, they are a great nation. And of course, that's just going to continue to increase, and when they conquer Canaan and all those things. So God fulfills his promises. Now, we also see in this section, verses 7 through 14, that there is a new Pharaoh on the throne. So what's a Pharaoh? The king of what country? Egypt, right, yeah, the king of Egypt. So there is a new Pharaoh on the throne that comes in here, and it tells us that this new Pharaoh either doesn't know anything about Joseph, never heard of Joseph, which is kind of hard to believe, but maybe. He never heard of Joseph, or maybe he had, but he simply didn't care anything about what Joseph had done for Egypt and how Joseph had faithfully served and helped out a previous Pharaoh. So either he didn't know anything about it at all, or he didn't care, didn't have any respect for it. Okay? Because that's what the Bible tells us in verse 8. Now there rose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Okay, so again, it either means he didn't know anything about him, or he just I don't care about it. That was then. I'm focused on now. I don't care what some guy did back then. I'm just worried about today. Because if you're the new Pharaoh, you're thinking, well, Joseph's dead. He can't do anything for me. He might have done something for one of my predecessors, but that doesn't help me, so I really don't care what he did. So who is this Pharaoh? Because the Bible doesn't say. It just says a Pharaoh of Egypt, and y'all know I'm a history nerd, so you know that very painfully, right? So which Pharaoh is it? Well, we can't really say it with much certainty because a lot of the Egyptian records are kind of fuzzy, and but we maybe can have a couple of ideas. So again, if you're looking at the lifespan of Moses, that would be from about 1530 to about 1410. Okay, and so you're looking at, all right, to be in that time frame would be this Pharaoh that we're going to read about here. And so this would be during what they call the 18th dynasty of the Pharaohs. And so Amenhotep I, it could be the one we're talking about, or it could be a guy by the name of Tutmos I. Again, I'm not going to ask you that on the test or anything. We're just kind of speculating here, but it's probably one of those two guys if you look at the historical record. Like I said, the dates are kind of murky and there's some disagreement, but I'm thinking it's a good chance it's one of those two guys probably is the Pharaoh that Moses is dealing with here. And so, again, he doesn't care anything about what Joseph did, and he doesn't feel a sense of obligation that, well, you know, Joseph's descendants, I really ought to treat them good and be good to them because of what Joseph, he doesn't care. What he's worried about is how many of them there are now. Okay? There's not 70 anymore. There's a really large number, and he's worried about that because they actually outnumber the Egyptians. Okay? And so he's afraid of them. It tells us here in this passage that he's afraid, well, what if they decide to join up with our enemies? They could just overrun us. They could destroy my kingdom. So that when he looks at the Israelites, that's what he sees. He sees a threat. Okay? And so he decides, because of that, that he needs to enslave them. And that we see, again, if you look at history, something similar in the American South before the Civil War. There were a lot of places where the slaves outnumbered the slave owners, the non-slaves. And so that was a constant worry for a lot of these places in the pre-Civil War South. They were worried about slave revolts, and hey, there's more of them than there is of us, and what happens if they decide to turn against us, you know. So we've seen examples of that even in more recent history. So you can kind of understand what Pharaoh is worried about. So he said, well, you know what, we're just going to have to ride herd on them. We're going to have to put them down. So we're going to enslave them, and we're going to make their lives as miserable as possible. Now, that's one way of doing it. Some people might say, well, if you're worried about them rebelling against you, maybe you ought to be nice to them. Then they wouldn't have any reason to rebel. But anyway, he decides this is what he's going to do. Because I guess, you know, you're Pharaoh, you believe you're the absolute king, you believe you're a god. So you don't have to condescend to anybody, right? You just say, I'm just going to stomp on them. So that's what he decides to do. And maybe he was hoping that, you know, if we can work them hard enough, what might happen? We use a phrase, and sometimes in history it's been literal. We're going to work those people to death. Work them to death. You literally kill some people from overwork. I mean, the body just gives out. Right? So he might have been hoping, you know, we can thin the herd. If we give them so much hard physical labor, they'll start dropping like flies. And maybe that'll make us a little more secure. So for whatever reason, he's going to enslave them and be really hard on them, making them do hard physical labor. And, of course, Egypt, very hot, grueling hot temperatures. We can relate to that here. But in spite of this, in spite of Pharaoh's efforts, What he doesn't realize, but he's going to find out the hard way, these particular people have somebody on their side. Who is that? God's on their side. So in spite of Pharaoh's efforts, the Israelites continue to prosper. So he's hoping to thin the herd or what, but that's not working. They're continuing to increase. And so Pharaoh decides, I've got to take some very drastic action. So in verses 15 through 22, to close out the chapter, Pharaoh calls in the Hebrew midwives. And there are 2 of them mentioned by name. I would assume there's probably more than 2, but maybe they were in charge of the other ones. But there's only 2 mentioned by name. But he calls them in, and he says, what I want you to do, because you're a midwife, and so you go to help with the birth and delivery, and before they had modern-day hospitals. And I mean, there are still midwives today. Some people choose to do that. So he said, you're going to be involved in the childbirth. Well, for every male Hebrew child, I want you to kill that child. Make sure the child doesn't survive the childbirth. You can let the girls live, but don't let the boys live. Okay? So pretty harsh, pretty drastic action. And we see in verse 17, are they going to obey Pharaoh or not? They're not going to. Why not? The midwives feared God. Good for them. Right? So they don't want to have anything to do with this. And so they refused to do it. They continued to save the boys. They did not kill them like Pharaoh told them to. Well, you think, will that go unnoticed? No, Pharaoh realizes, man, there's an awful lot of Hebrew boys running around here. I thought I told them to kill those people. So he calls them back in. And what do you think to do what? Congratulate them? Hey, thanks for not doing what I told you, right? So he's going to call them in to confront them. Why did you not do what I commanded you to do? And remember, he's got the power of life and death. He can have them executed for this. So I'm sure they were petrified, but he calls them in, and why'd you not do what I said? So they come up with a really good excuse, which was probably true. Well, they tell him, they said, well, we try to do that, but when a Hebrew woman gets ready to give birth and they send for us, by the time we get there, she's already given birth. It's too late for us to, unless we just blatantly kill the kid. You didn't tell us to do that. You just said make sure they don't survive the childbirth. Well, they've already been born by the time we get there. Do what? No, not today. Yeah, abortion's not a problem for anybody, or hardly anybody. So they said, we would, we could have done it, but it's just too late, and we can't do that because they've already given birth. Now, did they lie about that? Well, I don't think they did, because God's going to reward them, and God doesn't reward liars, right? God rewarded them. And something interesting, again, when you look at the historical, the non-biblical, but just the historical record, the Egyptians, I'm sure y'all are aware, they had a lot of drawings on their buildings. They did hieroglyphics, but they also drew pictures, right? And if you look at those drawings, they do show, whenever they draw Egyptian women, they are small and petite and by implication like kind of weak and not very strong. But whenever you see drawings of Hebrew women from the same time period, the Hebrew women are depicted as being big boned, like bigger, stronger women. So it's entirely possible that, because these women were implying, well, they're tougher than Egyptian women. Egyptian women need a lot of help in childbirth, but these Hebrew ladies, they don't They can do it themselves. But when you see the drawings, it kind of looks that way, like maybe physically speaking, that's... So they probably, maybe they weren't lying about it. They were like, hey, of course they probably took their time. Hey, she's giving birth, you need to come over. Okay, well, I'll be along, So they probably were leisurely going to the house, hoping that that would be the case, but that seems to be true, right? So you think at this point, is Pharaoh going to say, oh, well, I guess I can't do anything about it? No, he's not going to give up. So now he issues a new decree to everyone, not just to midwives, not just to the Hebrew midwives, but he tells everyone that all male Hebrew children must be thrown into the river, assuming the Nile River. So whenever a male Hebrew child is born, you take that child and drown him in the river. That way that eliminates the midwife problem. So he's determined, I'm going to get this population down one way or another because he sees them as a threat. All right, so let's go to chapter 2. Verses 1 through 10 will be the first section we'll look at. So we see here, as we read this passage, talks about Moses being born to his parents, Amram and Jochebed. Okay, and in Hebrew, or rather Exodus 6 and verse 20, and Amram took him Jochebed, his father's sister, to wife, and she bare him Aaron and Moses. And the years of the life of Amram were 137 years. Okay, so we see from that Moses has a brother named Aaron. Okay, and we know that Aaron is older than Moses, because if you look at Exodus 7 and verse 7, it says that Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old, when they spake unto Pharaoh. Okay, so Aaron is 3 years older than Moses. Now, something else, if we look at Exodus 15 and verse 20, we notice that Moses and Aaron had a sister, an older sister. Exodus 15 and verse 20, and Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dances. Okay, so they have a sister, Miriam, and Moses has a brother named Aaron. So those three children we know of for sure. Okay, now, how do we know, because it doesn't tell us there, how do we know that Miriam is older? Do what? Yeah, so when Mom puts Moses in the river, Miriam was watching. Moses just a baby at that point, so obviously Miriam, we're not sure how much older, because we're not told. We know Aaron is 3 years older. Miriam's at least, I guess, as old as Aaron, maybe a little bit older than that. But anyway, so we see here in this account that his mother, Moses' mother, Jochebed, she hid him for as long as she thought she'd get away with it, which was about 3 months, because she doesn't want him to be killed or thrown into the river. And so when it becomes impossible, she realizes he's getting big, and I'm not going to be able to hide him any longer. So she puts him in a little boat that you could call by another name. What can you call that? An ark. Didn't we read something about that in Genesis somewhere? Wasn't there another ark or something? Save people by water. So she puts baby Moses in an ark. And in the flags, it says, which is the reeds that grow on the shore of the Nile. So she puts him there. And so it's obvious she was hoping that somebody would find him that wouldn't kill him. She feels like at this point, that's the only chance she has. I hope that somebody finds him that won't just throw him into the river. Okay? Now, that's that going to happen? Mm-hmm. So you could say, well, she's in luck, but probably the providence of God. Luck probably didn't have anything to do with it. So older sister Miriam is standing off in the distance watching to see, okay, is anybody going to find him and what are they going to do with him? And so who finds him? Pharaoh's daughter. She found him. And so it's interesting, we said Tutmos the first might have been the Pharaoh. Well, if he was, and it does make sense and it fits, but I'm not telling you, well, I know it was him. But there's some clues here that it could be him. If it was him, then this princess, his daughter, that could have meant that she was Hatshepsut. Okay, well, who's that? Well, Hatshepsut will grow up to be a pharaoh herself. And there are very few, as you can imagine, very few female pharaohs. She is one of the most famous ones, along with another one. Anybody name her? Who? Cleopatra, yeah. That's probably the only two, and Cleopatra is the most famous, but Hatshepsut, there's a whole lot of stuff about her. So she would have been Tutmos' daughter. So this might have been her, because the interesting thing about the historical record of Hatshepsut, she had a soft spot, if you will. She had a compassion for foreigners, which most Egyptian rulers did not have. They didn't care. But she did. For whatever reason, she did. So if this was her, and I'm not saying it was, it might not have been her, but if it was her, that would kind of fit the historical record of her, that she knew this was a Hebrew child, and her father had said, kill them all. So you would think the daughter said, well, my father said, so let's throw this kid in the river, but she doesn't do it. So that would fit with this. I've got a compassion for foreigners, people that are not Egyptians, so that's why I think it could be her. Okay? So the daughter, it says here, she knew Moses was a Hebrew child. She could tell. But she disregarded her father's command. She decides to keep the child. Okay? So that's interesting. And so she is the one that gives the child his name, Moses, which means taken out, drawn forth. So that makes sense for his name, right? He's taken out or drawn forth out of the river. So that would make sense. So she gives him the name. So then Miriam conveniently shows up and says, oh, you found a baby. Would you like me to get somebody to take care of her for you, Your Highness? You know, because she's Pharaoh's daughter. And yeah, that's a good idea. Why don't you go find me somebody to take care of Moses? So who does Miriam find? Jochebed, her mother, right? And the princess says, I'll pay you, or I'll pay the woman to take care of her. So now Moses' mother is actually getting paid money to take care of her own kid. You got to love that. That's great. Okay, again, I think some providence of God in there. And so once he was weaned, then the princess, Pharaoh's daughter, she's going to raise him as her own son. And so we see in the New Testament, if we look at Acts 7 and verse 22, what kind of education did Moses have? Well, we find out. And Moses was learned in all wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Okay, so he gets the finest Egyptian education, which you would imagine being the son of Pharaoh's daughter, right? And then we see in Deuteronomy 34 and verse 7, Moses lived for 120 years. Okay? And so we can divide his life and we'll, oh yeah, I've gone over. Sorry about that. We'll stop right here and take a break. But you can divide Moses' life into three main periods. So he lived to be 120 years old. So it's real simple math. 40 years, 40 years, 40 years. So the first 40 years, from the time Moses was born until he's 40 years old, he lived in the palace as Pharaoh's daughter's son or Pharaoh's grandson for the first 40 years. The second, from ages 40 to 80, he's going to live in Midian as a shepherd. And then from ages 80 to 120, that's at age 80, that's when God is going to call him you are going to lead my people out of Egypt. So those last 40 years, he is the leader of God's people until he dies and Joshua takes over. Okay, so we'll take a break for a few minutes, and then we'll pick it back up here. And so we're almost right on schedule.